John Scaldi is a really good science fiction writer, and he tweets a lot, and he said if enough people come to your reading, if more people come to your reading than books that you've published, you still win. So I won by a lot today, so I'm really glad you're all here. Thanks for coming. So I call this thing Write Your Own Story because it's a good way to talk about myself and make it sound like it's about you, which is everybody's trick to public speaking. And I really hope some of you here want to be writers, but even if you don't, I have interesting stuff that you can apply to just about anything you do after Msjc, and even while you're here. So that's me. So how many of you have ever looked at the Wikipedia page for Msjc? Ever check it out? Some stuff you might not expect. We have a super long list of notable faculty, including John Seed, who's in this room, Professor Ricky Ann Rycraft, Nick Reeves is on the list. Like, we have some really great teachers who've contributed good research and great things and published books. And our notable student page, notable alumni, is a little bit shorter. Christy Hemme is our most well-known alumni from here, I should say. She works for WWE and TNA. She does backstage interviews. She was a wrestler for a while. She's done some modeling, some acting, some singing. She's very, very successful at what she set out to do. That's awesome. We have a couple of professional athletes, somebody from the Mariners, somebody from the Baltimore Ravens. That guy who played for the NBA bounced around for a number of teams, which is why they don't really call it out. So my point is, this is one of my life goals. I really want to be on this list. It's not alphabetical yet because there aren't enough of us, so I'll take the top. And then I really hope that there are so many of us that it has to be alphabetized and that maybe it becomes its own page, because I would really love to see that. So think about it, short list, really easy to get on. So this is me. Like the flyer says, I am a high school dropout. I went to high school right here in Hemet. Did not work out for me. I was really bad at structured environments and doing what people told me to. So I left high school and I moved to Europe for a while, and I bounced around and did some stupid jobs until I decided to get my GED. And then I said, well, I don't really think school's for me. I'm probably just going to work for a while. And my husband went back to school, starting here at Msjc, and every time he came home, he'd tell me something that made me jealous. So it's like, oh, you got to read that book. Oh, you got to have that discussion. And it's like, well, maybe school would be fun. I wasn't planning on doing anything with it. I was real dumb. That's the short version of that story. So I ended up here at Msjc. I had really, really great teachers, which you guys all know because you have them too. I graduated in 2012 with my degree in liberal studies, something very broad. And I transferred to UC Berkeley. I have a lot of thoughts about transfer and about the way things change and how difficult the work is and what's different and what's the same, and I want to share some of that with you. When I was at Berkeley, I became a journalist. I wrote first for student publications and then for professional publications. I've done a bit of both. I've done some editing. And then in 2013, when I was working on becoming a writer at Berkeley, I got into a number of anthologies. This one at the top here from the Four-Chambered Heart is a tribute to Anais Nin. So it's poems and stories based on her work or based on her or the artist's relationship with her. The one on the bottom, Alternate Lanes, is a story of loads of alternate transportation in Los Angeles. If you've ever been to LA, you know it's really hard to get around, even if you have a car, and if you don't have a car, it's something like hell. So that's what most of those stories are about. In my last year at Cal, I got involved in a project with a paper there, the Daily Californian, this book called 50 Years of Free Speech, Perspectives on the Free Speech Movement that Revolutionized Berkeley. When people talk about the hippies at Berkeley and the upstarts and the protesters, they're talking about 1964. It still exists and it still happens, but most of it happened then. I got into that by being in the right place at the right time and saying yes, and I got to write a book, which is something else I'll talk about. Most important thing I published is the book of the Unnamed Midwife. That's the first book I published that is entirely mine. That's my invention. It's fiction. It's science fiction. Technically, it's more like speculative fiction. As you know, there's a small difference. It's a post-apocalyptic adventure story with a female hero. And when I started looking at that, I started looking at the way that almost all post-apocalyptic fiction focuses on men, and the stories where they focus on women overlook a lot of the difficulties of being a woman in a recently post-industrialized society. And I realized this story hadn't been told. So everybody says, write the book you wish you found on the shelf, and that's what I set out to do. So the good news about this book is that it got nominated for an award, which is really hard for a first-time writer. And it's especially hard for somebody like me because I have an extremely small press. My press is 2 women in Los Angeles who run it out of their apartment. They took a huge gamble on my book, and they don't normally publish books like mine, so I felt good about that. And they told me originally, at some point last year, that my book had been nominated for this award. This award is open to anybody who publishes in paperback. That's more people now than it's ever been at any other time in history. There was something like 9,000 recommendations. It's like, okay, cool, whatever, it's in a box somewhere. Like 6 months later, I sleep in, I had been up really, really late the night before, and my phone's under my pillow. You know, we'll do that, right? So my phone won't stop going off. It's vibrating, 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 vibrating. So I get out of bed, and I wander across the house, and I'm trying to see it, and I can't even look at it properly, and I have all these tweets and emails from people I don't know, and I'm like, what happened? So out of probably 9,000 recommendations, there are 6 nominations for the PKD. Mine is one of them. This is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me, the biggest deal of my entire life. So in April, I'm going to go to a convention in Seattle. It's called NorwestCon. It's Northwestern Sci-Fi and Fantasy Con, so we have both a dragon and a spaceship. And they're going to have a ceremony for us, and somebody has to win. Might as well be me. But I've been reading the other books on the list, and they're very good. I'm up against some really talented people. I'm also up against major publishers. Annie and Toronto is published by Harper. Elysium is published by Bad Robot. Like, there's big names here. I'm definitely an underdog. Coincidentally, the book cover was designed by a friend of mine who is also an Msjc student. His name's Devin Cooper. It looks like we shot it in a warehouse. It's actually all miniatures. That's a dollhouse chair. People can't tell the first time, so I really loved that. And like, I wanted a false pregnancy belly, and I didn't know how to create it. I was like, maybe I could do that with paper mache. So we dyed an egg black and cut it in half. He's very creative. I don't know what I would have done without him. So he lit and shot this, so it's really difficult to tell. Very exciting times. So that's me establishing my credentials now that I'm convinced that I'm awesome. I get to give you advice. Yay. I actually do this fairly often. I go and talk to the new writers of the Daily Californian every time they get a crop in after me. So I have some things that I always say and some things that are specific to you guys. So I hope you get something out of it. Being a transfer. It's awesome and it's awful. I was talking to Professor Osmond before we started about how prepared I was for work at Cal, because I really was, especially because I was in the honors program. But I was more prepared than graduates of other community colleges, better than Msjc, better than San Francisco City College, and I was more prepared than people who had been at Cal since they were freshmen. We really get put through the ropes here. It's good for you. It sucks, but do the work. So ways that it's awesome. I didn't think school was for me. Like I said, I got to work that out here. I got to take a lot of classes and a lot of subjects and things that I wasn't going to major in, but I didn't know that. I took a whole bunch of anthropology courses. It really informed my studies, even though it's not what I ended up doing. I took biotech. I got to breed glow-in-the-dark bacteria. Nobody gets to do that in English. That was really cool. I took sign language here with Leslie Greer. Well, she's still upstairs, but she's a fantastic teacher. I got to be almost fluent in the language. It helps me all the time, especially because I live around. There's a huge school for the deaf in Riverside, and there's another one in Fremont, so no matter where I go, I'm close to one. That's been really useful. We have great faculty here. I'm just going to keep pounding on that, who actually know you. I think I have 2 professors from Cal who know who I am, and it's because I worked really hard for them to know who I am. Most of them couldn't pick me out of a lineup. The classes are really big, and they have a hard job, and they're just not going to get to know you. You get that here. Suck up all the attention. You show up knowing how to student. I did not know how to student when I started here. I had forgotten how to take notes and how to show up on time and how to figure out what's important in the information that you're given and what you can just like slide through. If you show up at Cal not knowing how to do that, or if you show up at UCLA, you're going to have a bad time. You get to work that out here. That's great. I saved hella money. People who went to Cal for 4 years owe twice what I owe, and I don't know much because I got a lot of grants, but still, if you're in a position to have to pay some of it, you pay a lot less here. If you're not ready after high school, that's not a problem, and I was not ready after high school. Like I said, dropped out, bad plans, bad ideas, and I could not have done this then. A few years of community college, and I could do it. Those are the ways that it's awesome. There are many other ways that it's awesome. Feel free to offer some. Ways that it's awful. Adjusting. Culture is very different, and I think most of the students I met in community college were working class, and their parents were working class, and it's really hard to hang out with rich people if you've never done it before. They are like foreigners. It's very strange. There was an adjustment there. There was an adjustment in class sizes. There was an adjustment in what professors expected from you or how you could address them when you spoke up in class. It's a lot less familiar sometimes. Commuting. I was a commuter for a long time because I have a communal household with something like a family, so we couldn't live in housing on campus. Even if you live on housing on campus, if you're in family or transfer housing, it's usually further away. At Cal, it's like half an hour away. Being removed from the immediate student body, being not able to live in the dorms changes what you can do and how much free time you can spend there and how long it takes you to get to and from and what you think your options are. Not every transfer will commute, but most of us did, and it changes the way the school feels. It's not as immediate, it's not always in your face. We had an explosion on campus that a bunch of my friends got to cover. It happened in the tunnels underneath, but it blew a manhole. And a lot of my good friends who are reporters are the kind of people who run toward explosions, and I was very proud of them that day, but I couldn't be there. So there's always going to be something that happens that we're just going to miss out on.
Hey, Meg?
Yeah.
When you say adjusting to rich people, do you mean like the affluence of the Bay Area or other students? Who are the rich people?
It's pronounced because I'm in the Bay Area and it is such a wealthy place. It's also going to school with kids who grew up in a lot more privilege than I had. People who go to Berkeley as freshmen have something going for them that you don't, whether it's academically or money-wise. But I think here I could say something about my work schedule or the difficulty of paying for gas or any of that, and that people would immediately understand it. You're like, oh yeah, that's a universal struggle. I was talking to a friend of mine one day at Berkeley, and she said how hard it was to call her dad at home and to share her problems with him. And I was like, oh, is he working class? Did he not go to college? She's like, no, he's a neurosurgeon and he thinks I complain too much, and he lives in Paris and we have a time difference. It's not the struggle I was expecting. That was a lot of adjustment. You may have rich friends and you might be better at that. I don't know. I wasn't good at it. I had to learn to speak the language. You only have 2 years. That seems obvious, but when you start getting into it, it goes by so fast, especially if you take a bunch of classes. As a transfer student, one of the coolest things that I did was to get involved with stuff, but you have to remember you only have 2 years, so you can't really sit out your first semester and decide what you're going to do. You have to hit the ground running. You have to do stuff that scares you, and you have to sign up for classes that you might not be able to stay in, understanding that you can drop them. And you have to immediately start networking. You have to immediately start going to events. You have to make up for lost time, and it went by incredibly fast. I feel like I was at Berkeley for about 6 months. And fitting in. At a really diverse school, like a lot of people will transfer to, like UCLA is extremely diverse, and most of the UCs give you a lot to go on. If you didn't start off there, you will always be a little bit different. People will have shared experiences of like freshman comp, like everybody went through the same English classes. Everybody went through the same basic poli-sci. Everybody had to go through the GEs, right? If you didn't do them there, people will have a shared lexicon about it that you won't be part of. If you weren't on campus during certain memorable events, like I was on campus during Obama's second inauguration, which was fantastic, but people who transferred in the year after didn't have that reference point. People who have been there the whole time are reading the same publications, they're hearing the same rumors, they're all part of the same local culture. You will be new to all of that. You also might be slightly older. You might be a student parent. You might be from a very different background. You might be from a very different part of the state or the country. All of that is a barrier to fitting in. There's no way to do it but to do it. There's no secret to it. You just have to show up and act like you belong. I call it the Jedi mind trick. I totally belong here. I totally have what you have. It's going to be fine. So that process of fitting in is what got me hired at Caliber magazine. That's the last issue that I directly contributed to. That's Robert Reich on the cover. He's a former, it's going to kill me, Joint Chiefs of Staff. He worked for the president. He worked for Reagan and then again for another, can't remember. He was important in the government. There we go. He talks about economics a lot and about inequality. He made that movie Inequality for All. He's now a professor of wealth and poverty at Cal. We got to interview him and put him on the cover. He was really great about it. So the first time I went to a meeting for Caliber magazine, I sat on the wrong side of the room. I usually sit myself on that side of the room so that when I decide I'm ready to dip, I go out the door. I didn't want to commit, and I didn't know if I was going to belong there. The officers of the magazine were all sorority girls. That was something else I had to get used to. Their culture was very different from mine. The way they spoke was very different than mine. They passed out bottle openers and lanyards with the magazine's logo on them, and they kind of gave off a party vibe. And they started talking about what they do and how much fun it is and what a social club it is, and I did not belong there at all. I did not want to be there. I was very uncomfortable, but because I had sat on the far side of the room, I felt like it would be rude to walk out, so I stayed. So they started talking, finally, about their ambitions. They talked about the last president of Caliber magazine who left and went immediately into a job at GQ, to the people who left the magazine and gone to the San Francisco Chronicle or to the Gawker family of publications, and I realized we at least had ambition in common. And I made myself stay even though I was uncomfortable and really didn't feel like I belonged there. And in time I really did. And I had great friends there and we did good work together. But the barrier is real, don't underestimate it. The other thing that came to me about working for Caliber was time. When I first transferred to Cal, I took my job with me. I was really lucky to be able to do that. I worked at Home Depot, and Depot's one of those big national corporations that when you move to somewhere else, you can transfer and get a similar job somewhere else. As long as you have some skills, they'll take you. So I was able to do that, but when I got involved in writing for a magazine, it took up all my time. So I talked to my husband, and again, another thing I'm lucky to have, and asked him if he'd be okay if I quit my job. It was a huge wobble for us, and it was not easy, and it was a massive risk to take. But because I worked for Caliber, I got a better job at the school through the work-study program, which was very respectful of the fact that my studies came first and paid way more. Get into work-study if you can, by the way. I got to work as a research assistant for the College of Human Development at Cal. I transcribed classroom interactions from morality lessons given to low-income students in Oakland, which was actually really interesting. It wasn't just like transcribing nonsense, I was transcribing some stuff I could really get into. I learned a lot from the appointment, and all of those things happened because I decided to go past my comfort point, I decided to take a risk, I decided to restructure my time, and really what that came down to was I changed my mindset. I didn't think like a community college student anymore, I thought like a Cal student. That's my first semester at Cal. That was a lot. I was overwhelmed, I was very stressed. They worked. So Caliber was great, but it's a really small publication, and I didn't feel like I was getting enough of a soapbox, and I really like to have a big soapbox. So I applied at the Daily Californian, which is the newspaper not only of the University of California, but it's the only newspaper in Berkeley. So we get to cover all kinds of things. My first application to the Daily Californian was shut down. They said no, because I didn't give them something that I loved, and I know that now. I gave them something that I liked. It's not enough. So when I came back, what I pitched was a series of columns called Broken Berkeley, because I realized after being there for a semester how different it felt to not be one of those affluent kids who gets money from home. And I wrote about riding the bus and scrounging for pencils and having to fix my cell phone when I broke it. And it caught people's imagination. I got letters from all over the country. I got letters from alumni and people who read it at UCLA and people who read it on the internet. I had readers in Germany and Turkey, and it struck a nerve, and that worked out. So what I learned at the Daily Californian was stay hungry. If you get to say yes to one thing, there will be other things to say yes to. Always say yes. I saw people lose their appointments as columnists and as bloggers. I saw them lose interviews with big stars and big directors because they just weren't hungry. They didn't care. They didn't care if somebody else got it. So if I was in the office and I heard somebody miss their deadline, I'd take it. I'd take an hour and write whatever it is they had. I'd take their inches, I'd take their interviews. I would say yes to everything. That got me moved from opinion into arts and then into an editorial position, and then I was in the senior editorial board before I left. I got to be part of the decision-making group for a paper. We get yelled at a lot. We get threatened by cops. We got to break a story about the cops in Berkeley possibly killing a transgender activist when she was in custody. Things got messy. It was actually really great. So yeah, say yes to everything. Stay hungry. Get into stuff. Saying yes to everything only becomes difficult when you realize you're saying yes to something you don't love. It is impossible to fake enthusiasm. Everybody can tell when it's counterfeit. It's like when you used to like somebody and you don't like them anymore, but now they really like you, and they can tell you're faking it. That's really true about making art or producing any kind of work. People can tell when you don't love it. So anytime that I published something that I thought was just okay, the reception of it was just okay. People didn't like it, and people didn't share it, and people didn't write to me about it. But when I wrote stuff that made me feel really vulnerable and expressed something that I was afraid to talk about and made me really scared, that's when it worked out. That's when it got big. So do things that you're enthusiastic about. Say yes to everything until you have too many yeses, and then you figure out what you love best and keep it. As evidence for gifts. I love gifts, by the way. It's going to be a bunch of those. So what I love, what I can't not do, is writing. This was not new for me. I've really been a writer my whole life, but I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have any discipline for it, and I didn't have any outlets for it, and that's really hard to figure out, especially for the kind of person who's afraid to show their work. I didn't want to show anybody what I'd written. I didn't want them to read it. I didn't want them to judge it, and by extension, judge me, and that's all things you have to get by. It might not be the thing for you, If you want to be a writer, you will know that you should be a writer because you can't not do it. You can't stop doing it. You can't stop thinking about it. You're rewriting other people's stories because you didn't think they were good enough. You're changing the ending. You're saying, well, I wouldn't have ended that TV series there. That could have been done a whole lot better. You can't stop doing it. When I was working at Home Depot, I once wrote an entire novel, I'm not exaggerating, on a tiny pad of paper in my apron. Because Home Depot aprons have big, broad pockets at the bottom that you're supposed to carry all kinds of junk like a tape measure, and I didn't carry a tape measure, but I did carry pen and paper. And in the moments when I had downtime, I was writing a book. So I had this box of paper at home that I would go through and edit and see if any of it was good and type it in and save it and go back and revise it. And I realized I'm writing a book on the clock. I'm writing a book on the toilet. I'm writing a book on my phone. I can't not do it. That's how you know what the thing is. Whatever your thing is, it's the thing you can't not do. That's Thomas Jefferson, by the way. He couldn't not do it either. In the musical version, though, so it's still Thomas Jefferson. The thing about writing is nobody cares if you do it if you don't publish. A lot of people have a novel in the closet that's never going to go anywhere. A lot of people write really good Facebook status updates. It doesn't matter if you don't publish it. Nobody reads it. Nobody knows. So the publishing business is literally no one knows. If you came here to hear about that from me, I have a terrible lack of information to share with you. Publishing used to be a really elite job that only certain people at a certain level of education could do, and it's democratized now, which is fantastic, and we're hearing diverse voices in a mainstream way in a way that we never have before. However, everybody's publishing. Everybody. People who can't write at all are publishing. People who have no business putting pen on paper. People who have no story to tell or are telling thinly veiled retellings, or there are more books being published now than have ever been published at any time in history, period. If you want to be a writer, you're going to be one of them. You are a grain of sand on the beach. You are a cinder in hell. It's still the greatest job I've ever had, but publishing is no joke. So we have a slight apocalypse. We have what used to be traditional publishing in big 5 book houses that were the only ones that published books are falling down. My publisher and small publishers like them are starting to come up in places where nobody realized you could before, like using Amazon as a distributor, or self-publishing people and getting them to pay you, or publishing only in ebook form, or publishing chat books, or getting people to pay you to write blog posts on a system like Patreon or one of those pay-for-play things. People are funding their books through Kickstarter or starting up independent comic books by crowdfunding methods. There's no wrong way to do this. It's a really exciting Wild West, no rules time. So if you want to get your work out there, do it any way you can. Put it on Tumblr, network with weird people. Publishing is hard and the voices are many, but you can get your work out. We're very lucky. So my interpretation of that is a little crab creature with pom-poms. Because no matter how weird the thing is you want to do, you can do it. We can all be the crab creature with pom-poms. Write your own story. One of the best things about transferring and about being a writer and about a lot of stuff is you get to reinvent yourself. Madonna's got nothing on this game. You're going to go somewhere new and you're going to meet new people, and they are going to see you the way you want to be seen because you get to start over. So Jay Gatz becomes the Great Gatsby, and I became a writer and a Berkeley graduate and something more than a high school dropout, and we all get to remake this. So the thing that I wanted to tell people at Msjc was there's no reason to think of this as somewhere humble to start, and there's no reason to think of this as something that limits you. We're all coming from something great, going to something great, and we're all going to end up on the Notable Alumni page if that's where we want to be. So be Gatsby. If you've ever read Gatsby, read Gatsby. On the subject of limitations, there is no reason to think of this as something that limits you. I transferred with a lot of people who didn't get into anything. It's not because they weren't talented, and it's not because they weren't smart. They were all of those things, but they were afraid. They got to Berkeley, and they got to UCLA, and I had a friend who went to Cornell, and they kept their heads down. They were afraid to stand out. They were afraid to be weird. They were afraid to tell people they didn't come from there. They were afraid to join up because they didn't feel like they belonged. They were afraid to try out for the a cappella group because they thought it was weird that they were 4 or 5 years older. They were afraid to try out to write for the paper because they had such a different voice. Different voices are really important, by the way. Keeping your head down gets you nowhere. Not getting into things is not fun for you, and it's not fun for them. If you're spending your free time after transfer watching Netflix in your room, think about and look forward to unemployment, because that'll happen. But while you're there, use it up. There are things you'll get to do after you transfer, and there are things you can get to do here that you won't get to do anywhere else at any other time in your life. Don't waste it, and don't be afraid of it. Walk in everywhere like you belong. One of the most terrible things about transferring to Berkeley, okay, aside from the entire application process and staring at the applications and being like, let me in, one of the worst things about it is that there's an FAQ that they send you after you get accepted. The very first question at the top of the FAQ is, what if my admission to Berkeley is a mistake? The fact that people have asked that question enough times that they put it up top broke my heart. We all have imposter syndrome. We all feel like, I'm not really supposed to be here. It's garbage. It's garbage. It's garbage. You got in because you belong there. Wherever it is you end up going, you got in because they thought you were good enough. Don't be afraid of any part of that. Go suck the life out of it. So people who went to community college who went on to do good things, former Governor Schwarzenegger, Halle Berry, Queen Latifah, George Lucas, Walt Disney, a lot of people don't know about him, Tom Hanks, there's a couple of astronauts. Like I found a huge and diverse list of people who are community college, either attendees or graduates, who went on to do great things and change the world by like no uncertain terms. These are the people whose company you are joining. We all can do cool things. You have to be your own hype man. A lot of people are really insecure about their work or shy, or they've been socialized to think that they should not talk about themselves, or at least not talk about themselves well. When I talk to young writers, I always tell them you have to love you like Kanye loves Kanye. That is not a joke. You have to tell people you're a creative genius. And you have to tweet links to your own stuff, and you have to tweet good reviews, and you have to blog about stuff that you're doing, like making appearances at your community college. And you have to constantly tell people that you're producing work and that it's great and that they should be paying attention. Even if you get an agent, agents don't do it. Nobody else is going to be your hype man but you. Branding is the new bragging. When people used to talk about how awful it was when people talk about themselves and what they do, it's still awful, and there's a way to do it where you come off like an arrogant jerk, but there's also ways to do it where you come off like you know who you are and you know what you're selling. That's branding. It's difficult to find the space, but it's there. So my example is, when I applied to write the commencement speech for Berkeley, there are different ways to do it, and in some departments you have to be the top graduate, and in some departments you have to produce a thesis, and in some departments you just have to be really good with a professor. In English, all they care about is if you can write. So they said anybody can submit it, here's the due dates, here's what's going on. I went in 5 days before the due date and have to write it out and put it in paper in an envelope with a paper clip. It's very specific. And I gave it to the guy at the office, and I said, how many people am I up against? And he says, oh, there's only like 2 or 3, but it's not the last day. I was like, what do you mean it's not the last day? Oh, on the last day, I'll get like 25 entries. So I got to speak at commencement, which is fantastic. But what I did was hype myself before I even got in. So the day I turned that speech in was my pub date, and I told my article I'm going to write an article about how to write a commencement speech. So that if you Google commencement speech Berkeley, even before the decisions are made, you find my face. Subtle hype machine. And I talked about, for the most part, I talked about being inspired by other great commencement speakers. So I talked about, there's a really good speech you can watch on the internet that Steve Jobs gave at Stanford before he died, obviously. Peter Dinklage gave a really good one at Benetton. There's a wonderful one by Meryl Streep she went to some cool college, Smith maybe, a women's college. But my absolute favorite one is by Neil Gaiman, who I think is the greatest living writer of the English language. He spoke at the American Academy of Art in 2011 or 2012, and he talks about a lot of things that artists get caught up on, whatever kind of art they produce. Conditions will never be ideal, is what I took away from it. So there are things in your life that you think you will do when things get better. I think after I get this job, things will calm down. After I graduate, I'll be qualified to do that. Once I get these kids out of the house, I'll go back to being myself. Whatever it is, if you were meant to do it, you have to do it now. Conditions will never be right. Something will always be in the way. The only thing that changes is you. If you have to write a book in your apron, you have to write a book in your apron. Also in the speech, he says he had to imagine what he wanted to be, which was a writer, primarily of fiction, but of books of all kinds, was a mountain. And then you look at steps along the way, and you ask, am I getting closer to the mountain, or am I getting further away? And sometimes that means turning down good jobs, because they're not any closer to the mountain. And sometimes that means taking on silly things that might not pay. Like I write for a comedy group in Oakland right now, which is fantastic, and it doesn't pay anything. but I get to see my work on stage, and I get to see people try out dialogue that I wrote, and I can tell if it sounds right or not. I get to work with theater writers, and I get involved in festivals and things that other writers are doing that I wouldn't find out about otherwise. The point is, it gets me closer to the mountain. Writing for Caliber was the right thing until the next biggest thing came along, because it was closer to the mountain. Wherever it is you're supposed to be, ask yourself if you're getting closer or farther away. So Neil Gaiman says things go wrong in life and in love, and in business and in friendship and health and all the other ways that life can go wrong. And when things get tough, this is what you should do: make good art. Terrible things will happen. Husbands run away, parents die, natural disasters. Everything that happens to you is something that was meant to be art. My favorite thing that Osmond's ever said in class was that we aren't the only ape that has language. We figured out that other apes have language. We aren't the only ape that uses tools. We can see chimps fish for termites with a stick. We're not that interesting. We're not that unusual. We are the only ape that makes art. Unprompted and for no reason at all, we make art. It is the only thing we do that's worth a damn.
I think you're paraphrasing.
I think John has it written on the inside of one of his journals, like on the inside page. It's his favorite thing you've ever said, that too. It's both of our favorites. It's also the best answer I've ever had from an anthropology professor, like what makes us different. That's the thing. All other answers are incomplete. So I have many answers, sometimes complete, sometimes incomplete, about writing, about publishing, about transferring, about Berkeley in general and the UC system, Berkeley in specific and the UC system in general, and maybe gossip about your favorite professors.
Really, really busy as a freelance editor, and the reason she's so busy is what you mentioned. She gets some things that she thinks are just terrible, like you said, shouldn't be written, shouldn't be published. She gets some things that are terrific, and she gets everything in between. But the point is that kind of the new model is changing so fast, and there's so much material out there. It's anybody's guess, how it's all going to play out.
Editing right now is how I make most of my money, frankly. For those of you who want to talk about transparency and how writers make a living, editing makes way more money than writing. A lot of people write, and you mostly get small token payments. I think the best money I've ever made for anything that wasn't my book was like $150. But I edit manuscripts for people now, and I used to edit for a newspaper, but those desks are half empty, and the person who trained me had a picture of herself at her desk 4 years before I was born. There's no mobility and there's no new jobs in journalism type editing, but in manuscript editing from people who are desperate to publish their book, even though there may be no market for it and no one's ever going to read it, they want it shined up and they pay cash. It's pretty
By
great.
the way, the Huffington Post is hiring.
Hey, I'll look into that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I can bloviate for them. Sorry.
What would you say is the best way to practice editing? Aside from editing your own?
Get to be friends with whoever you know in your circle, because everybody's writing papers. We used to have basically table reads in a circle. You have to kind of get past the ego thing of letting your friends read your academic work and how they feel about it. But you're much sharper at catching somebody else's mistakes than your own. And then once you get better at other people's mistakes, you start to see yours. So trade papers with your friends, even if you're not in their subject. You know, like, this is not a complete sentence, this is a badly formatted reference. You have to sharpen your tools that way. Becoming a good editor of your own stuff is like advanced level 201. When I wrote for the newspaper, I read everything out loud. I had that option because it was under 1,000 words, and even with a deadline. I see the face you're making, I know.
No, it's not that. It's just, what if you treat your work like Tolkien's ring? It's just so precious, you should read it over.
Oh, that's really hard to overcome. It is that precious. Your work is that precious. It is all that will be left of you, probably. None of us is immortal, and eventually even our kids will experience the death of the universe, but the One Ring only gets to Mordor because he lets other people carry it, and he lets other people carry him. It is that precious. It has to stay that way. It's not, one man is not enough.
Okay, so is there like a forum that you know of that's like well populated with people who are constantly like publishing their own work?
A couple, yeah. There's a couple of good subreddits. If you're not terrified of Reddit, there's one, I know it's an awful place sometimes. There's an R for writing prompts, where people come up with sometimes really shockingly original ideas, and people suggest small prompts and long prompts, and I've seen up to like 2,500 words and down to flash pieces of about 100 words. You get immediate feedback from people who liked it or didn't like it. Sometimes tuning advice, like this would have more impact if, or I really like this sentence, you could end it there. Nobody on there is a pro. Some people on there might be pros. I don't know if they don't apply their professional rigor to it. But you get really quick feedback in an anonymous forum from people who are doing the same thing that you are. If that's all you can do, that's totally enough. There are lots of places on the internet to do it. Tumblr's another one. There's a lot of Tumblr writers and poets, and frankly, fan fiction. People who write fanfic have a deep, dedicated community of readers and editors and people who offer corrections and who offer feedback, and that's another really good anonymous place to shine up your skills and to gather some ego points.
On Tumblr, how would you find a group? I think of Tumblr blogs as being like individual. How do you find a group or a cluster?
You have to find people who constantly reblog for each other, and you follow their tags.
Okay.
So like if this person always reblogs that person who always reblogs that person, you have a loose confederation of Tumblrs. You're right, it's not set up in such a way that you have a flotilla of Tumblrs, but you follow the chains.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other piece of advice I have, and this is for everybody, is to make a writing group. Get anybody you can who writes together, and don't be afraid of people who write different stuff. Like meet a romance writer, meet a poet, meet somebody who's going to write children's book, because it's all the same skill. And I get feedback from people who write, graphic novels, YA, old school science fiction, and contemporary literary, and they all see different things. Like some of them are really good at story editing, and some of them are really good at sentence tuning and prosody, and some of them have a background in classic literature and can tell me, this thing is like this other thing and something I haven't read. So a diverse community of writers who are not afraid to show their work and not afraid to tell you the truth are the people you really want to find.
Get to know people who are like you.
Get to know people who are like you is like the solution to half the things in life. But until then, there's Reddit. No other writers? Just yeah.
What do you think about, or do you have to be somebody really famous to tell your own story?
Absolutely not. Everybody should be able to tell their own story. It helps. The thing about being famous, or even semi-famous like I am, or more famous like Professor Seed is just the more people are listening. So I have friends who only have like 3 or 4 followers on their blog, or like 30 or 40 followers on their Twitter. But you have to think of each person who reads anything you put up on the internet, even if your circle is this big, each person is a ripple. So if anybody repeats something you said, or reblogs something that you blogged, or links to you, or mentions it to someone in conversation, those ripples go way further out than you could possibly perceive. So you may not be famous and you may not have any kind of a soapbox to climb up on top of, but you have to keep talking about your work and keep putting it out there, even if you don't have any kind of a reach yet. That's how you develop a reach. Also, when I first started, I remember I was hoarding things. I was holding on to stories that I wanted to tell when I could tell them better, or when I could tell them to more people. The time that the story comes to you is the time it should be told. There's a really sad story by Ernest Hemingway. Can't remember which one. He's hunting lions in Africa, which does not help. But he gets hurt, and he has a terrible infection. He can barely move, and he realizes he's going to die of it because he's so far away from any medical help. And nothing really makes him sad because it's Hemingway, and life has no meaning, and he's not worried about the women in his life. But he does lay there feeling sorry for himself, and then it hits him that he'll never write the things he was planning to write when he was better. And that's the only part about it that makes him cry, because he had work ahead of him that he wasn't going to get to. Nothing is guaranteed. Shooting lions gets you a terrible infection. Everybody's going to die. Tell the story you have to tell now. Tell it again better later. Tell it to more people later. But get it out and let it ripple.